So good morning from Egypt and Europe, and good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining from afar, and wishing you a good stable Wi-Fi connection for those of you who may be joining us at the conference center. I am not Kavi Gillenpour, who could unfortunately not join us today. He sends his apologies. I am stepping up on his behalf. My name is Jennifer Huang. I am the Associate Director of International Strategies at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. So we're at we've just finished the second technical dialogue of the Global Stocktake. It's concluded last week, which means that we're at the midway point of the Global Stocktake process, which will formally end at COP28 next year. So as part of our project on the Global Stocktake, I'm really pleased to be moderating this event, taking stock of the Global Stocktake. We have about an hour, and we have 4, possibly 5, if he can join us, excellent speakers. So I'll try to keep this and our introductions short, as you can also find them on the platform. So I've asked each of our speakers to provide some initial reactions and thoughts on the process at this key midway point, but also looking ahead to what needs to be accomplished in 2023 so that we have this really robust and effective outcome. So I will first turn to Lavanya Rajamani, who's a professor of international environmental law at the University of Oxford. So Lavanya, can you provide an overview of where we are in the GST process and what we're looking for in terms of an effective outcome, one that really gives us the kind of signals both to parties and non-parties and what they must do to enhance ambition and implementation?
Thank you, Jen. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to participate in C2ES events. To speak directly to the questions you've raised, where we are at, as you just indicated, we are at a midway point in the Global Stocktake. In terms of process, we're sort of bang in the middle of the information collection and preparation phase, as we all know. We've had 2 sessions of the technical dialogue, as you just indicated. And the process of developing key findings from the technical dialogue is underway and will be concluded after the 3rd and final session of the technical dialogue next June. An intersessional workshop and consultation before June 2023 is also on the cards. So the next step really is to translate these key findings from the technical dialogue into political signals in the consideration of outputs phase. And in terms of substance itself, the technical dialogue has covered quite a lot of ground in many ways. In terms of inputs, there have been a wide range of inputs, of course, UN synthesis sort of reports, the IPCC, a wide range of inputs from non-state actors in particular, in some senses dwarfing the inputs from states. Participation has been hugely inclusive, very unusually so for a UN process. Non-state actors have played a very prominent role, reflecting the reality, really, that addressing climate change requires buy-in and ownership from all. There have been many interesting and innovative formats and fora that the technical dialogue facilitators have experimented with, which have worked quite well. Focused exchanges, roundtables, poster sessions, even, again, ensuring engagement and accessibility across actors. And the most recent session has, in many senses, indicated a sort of taken a huge step forward in moving from just sharing of information, building of trust, to actually assessing and bridging sort of the gaps, moving from the what to the how to, as the facilitators keep telling us, really moving to the how we actually bridge gaps. And the technical dialogue is covering and has covered a wider range of topics and in much greater depth and detail than one might have expected initially. And there's a lot of focus on scalable, implementable, practical options across sectors. And as a result, there's already a sort of early identification of trends and gaps, including epistemic gaps, knowledge gaps. We now know some of the things that we don't know, and we need to know, in a sense. And so all of this is leading to some emerging key findings. In terms of what we're looking for in relation to signals from the Global Stocktake, I think the first thing to note is what we're not looking the GST to do for us, which is to tell us that we haven't done enough or that we're not on track. I think there's ample evidence of that, and we don't need the Global Stocktake to tell us that. And we could have, if that is all the global stocktake were to do, then we could have done that, or we could have written the outcome before the start of the global stocktake. So what the global stocktake really needs to do is to set us on a path to environmental effectiveness. This is something that we've been talking about for the last year or so. Environmental effectiveness in the UN climate regime, which means how we actually meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, not focus so much on how far off we are from achieving them, but about how we actually achieve them. And so in that sense, the signals that we're looking for from the global stocktake should be geared towards enabling robust implementation of the targets that we already have, and facilitating credible and fair target setting going forward. It should, we hope, catalyze action within the climate regime and outside the climate regime across states and non-state actors, across sectors and multiple governance levels. It should have outputs that are clearly operationalizable, so outputs that actually contain clear templates for action, and outputs that should be aligned with and complement and draw on sort of other processes in the regime, which is sort of course, for instance, the mitigation work program, the Global Goal on Adaptation, the Glasgow Dialogue, and the new collective quantified goal on finance. We need to do this so there's coherence and cohesiveness as we move towards environmental effectiveness in the regime. More broadly, the first global stocktake should also, we hope, provide a template for future global stocktakes, although as some have said, this global stocktake is perhaps the most critical one, given it is the one that is in the critical decade. However, it does need to provide a template for future global stocktakes as well. So in terms of what form these signals could take, the outputs we are looking for, it would be helpful to have a political declaration at a head of state even level, or certainly a ministerial level, reinforcing sort of direction of travel and urgency and underscoring gaps. And that should be the starting point, really. And then very squarely shifting the focus to implementation, and that is certainly also picking up on the fact that, COP27 is an implementation COP, and we've moved into an implementation phase in the UN regime. Sort of focus on implementation and support, going hand in hand in a sense with credibility and accountability as well, and signaling commitment to an all-of-society approach, which I think means setting the UN climate regime in the wider landscape of actors and actions. And this is something I know Sebastian is going to speak to in particular, and strengthening credibility and accountability even of actions by non-state actors. In addition to this political declaration, it would be we would need an umbrella sort of CMA decision highlighting the collective progress, so highlighting how far we've come, and gaps, how far we need to go, and more concretely identifying areas for collaboration and further action, how to get where we need to get. And in this context, it would be really helpful for the technical dialogue to actually not just have key findings in terms of the emerging understandings and that are coming out of these very interesting sessions, but actually contain annexes, potentially with best practices and scalable solutions across thematic areas and sectors, highlighting specific concrete opportunities for climate action, in particular across sectors, aligning with the IPCC AR6, a Working Group 3 report, which identified options for halving emissions in a range of sectors by 2030. So to the extent that it's sort of linked to those, and there are specific scalable options, menu of options in technical annexes, options not just for action that can be taken at the national level, but also for international cooperation and collaboration, and focusing on implementation. This would be very useful sort of an operationalizable element of the key findings sort of report from the technical dialogue, which then the umbrella CMA decision at the end could refer to. It also will need to establish feedback loops across processes internally, and ideally also other treaty regimes and organizations like the Convention on Biodiversity or ICAO or IMO. And this in particular into future rounds of GSTs. In addition, it would be helpful if this CMA decision also identified areas for systemic review and intervention, and initiated discussions in areas in which epistemic gaps have actually been identified, whether it is in relation to the global goal on adaptation or fair and ambitious contributions to the global goal on adaptation, or CDR, for instance. So this is, of course, a very ambitious wish list. In conclusion, though, I would say the global stocktake should enable and enhance implementation and ensure credible and fair target setting across mitigation, adaptation, and support to ensure that we're on track to making the Paris Agreement environmentally effective. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Lavanya. That's great. I really like that wish list. And turning to Juliana, who's Juliana Arcenegas, the project director at Transforma. Thanks so much for joining. And I'd like if you can kind of build on Lavanya's remarks and take us through maybe some of the milestones of the GST process, but also I was in the finance roundtables, but we haven't gotten to touch base yet on your engagement in the roundtables as you followed the adaptation and loss and damage roundtables. It'd be great if you could share some of your reflections on how the technical dialogue last week addressed adaptation and loss and damage, and maybe some means of implementation as well. And if you're seeing any of those elements that Lavanya's mentioned in those discussions, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and hello to all participants. I think that we need to start by highlighting that although there has been an effort, especially by the co-facilitators, to give proper time and space in the context of the technical dialogues for these three important areas: adaptation, loss and damage, and means of implementation, together with mitigation, of course. The level of maturity and clarity in terms of inputs and outputs and possible outputs has relied heavily upon the available information of each area and on the way in which issue has been considered by the Convention and the Paris Agreement in the past. Moreover, as Lavanya mentioned, there are important links to consider with the ongoing work of the Glasgow Sharm-el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation, the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage, and of course, with the negotiations of the new collective quantified goal on finance, to mention a few where there are linkages to consider, and where we basically have the same participants and stakeholders providing inputs and discussing how to understand better these issues and how to address those implementation gaps. So on adaptation, different to many other issues, the GST has very specific mandates in terms of, one, recognizing the efforts of developing countries. Second, reviewing the adequacy of support and the effectiveness of action. Third, reviewing the overall progress towards achieving the global goal on adaptation that was established by the Paris Agreement in Article 7.1. And fourth, in terms of enhancing the implementation of adaptation action, taking into account the adaptation communications. So the first two parts of this technical phase had put focus on the information to understand the progress, which will be critical not only to see where we are, but also to identify lessons learned, good experiences, gaps that will be needed to address in the future to advance in enhancing adaptation action. So it is very clear that the mandates we have are related, and advancing in the information of all of them will inform the rest of the mandates for future action. It has been clear that there are still important information and data gaps that will be needed to address for a more comprehensive assessment of progress. We do have a lot of information in terms of policies, of plans, but we are lacking a lot of information in terms of the effectiveness and the results of these plans in terms of how they reduce vulnerability and how they increase the adaptive capacities of countries. And it has been clear also in this process of the GST that a combination of approaches may be needed, that we may need quantitative and qualitative information together to have a better picture of adaptation action. And it has also been clear that there is no common denominator that can be used to aggregate the effects of adaptation in different countries. And this is the challenge that we've been facing, and this is the challenge that this work program from Glasgow to Sharm-el-Sheikh is also trying to address. So this GST can provide a foundation for improved approaches and data on adaptation. But of course, this is an exercise that needs to be improved over time, and we're still learning by doing. So in this technical dialogue, to respond to your question, as you know, there was a focus on the how we could address these implementation gaps that we have in all fields. And in adaptation, I think parties and non-state actors shared good experiences of different sectors that could be replicated or escalated to reduce vulnerability, to enhance adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience. For example, in terms of food systems, localization, and agroecology, there were a lot of examples on how this can be a key element to increase resilience in the face of drought, food scarcity, or interruptions in the transport network, with associated benefits for infrastructure, for local farmers markets, and biodiverse crops that have proven to be more resilient to the effects of climate change. We also saw a lot of initiatives on land rights for indigenous peoples and local communities as a central element to protecting strategic ecosystems and enhance their resilience to extreme weather events, while also protecting them from deforestation. On loss and damage, I think that although there has been several inputs from inside and outside the climate process in terms of the how that this technical dialogue wanted to address, developing countries have highlighted the need for the whole process, including the GST, to accelerate the response and to support in a more effective manner the way in which the climate impacts are being addressed by the most vulnerable populations, with sufficient resources, but also mechanisms that can be more easily manageable and easily to access by countries. But in addition to financial support, I think the parties have also raised the importance of advancing in the identification of needs, of considering multi-sectoral approaches to address losses and damages, to consider loss and damage as a more robust components of NDCs, given that not all countries have loss and damage in their NDCs, but we're seeing now more NDCs including them. Also to strengthen early warning systems, like some more other approaches that could be more technical or related to technological solutions. But in general, there was also a call to distinguish the possible solutions and approaches to loss and damage to the ones that we know for adaptation. In means of implementation, I think that, of course, there has been a lot of focus on finance, but we should not forget about the role of capacity building and technology transfer to address most of the barriers that countries have faced in the past as cross-cutting and enablers for action in mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And to complement the several sources of inputs that we had already and the information for the assessments of the progress on finance, perhaps I would like to highlight that in this technical dialogue, there was a clear call for aligning the financial flows and meeting the needs for system-wide transitions to net zero and transformative climate resilient development as requested by the IPCC. And in how we could make these transformations, well, participants raised that we need to go beyond incremental action to more transformational measures, including divesting from fossil fuels to climate smart investments, implementing fossil fuel subsidies reforms, not only to discourage investments, but also to subsidize renewable projects around renewable energy projects across the world, instituting global carbon prices, like those sort of initiatives or ideas that perhaps we knew from the past, but in reality are not necessarily occurring and may be needed for this transformation. So the focus was not only on the numbers, but also on thinking on innovative ways of addressing these challenges, and also discussions around the composition of the finance, the quality of the finance, and how can most vulnerable countries access in an easier manner to those funds. So in summary, I think there was progress in terms of identification of actions that could help us to fill implementation gaps, but still a lot of conversations were very, some of the conversations were very general, and I think we need to narrow them down a little bit more and continue in the upcoming months in the identification of solutions, but also in the identification of barriers and good examples and experiences of different countries, sectors, and regions that could be useful to address those in the future. So I will leave it there and happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. As you were going through that, I was thinking about how this process is not only learning by doing as we go through the GST, but in each of the technical dialogues, I think we're learning by doing as we go through this process of figuring out, what is our base of knowledge, where are we starting from? The approaches might be different from one room to the other, and even where we want to go is all a little bit different. So to be balanced, let's turn to mitigation now, and to Sebastian Oberder, professor at both Vrije Universiteit Brussels and the University of Eastern Finland. Sebastian, you have not been here, but you have been following this process closely. Can you tell us about how the Global Stocktake can examine where we are and where we're going on mitigation, but then also touch on this wider governance landscape and that intersection with the Global Stocktake process?
Many thanks, Jennifer. Yes, I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there, but indeed have been following it from a distance here from Brussels. Let me talk to two subjects. First, this kind of signal that is being talked about, right? That should be one of the main outcomes, I guess, of the global stocktake, and then, as you indicated, the wider landscape. So we have already heard from Lavanya also, we need this signal, or we need signals, perhaps in the plural. But then the question is to whom and how, right? For a signal, you need somebody who sends the signal, but you also need somebody who receives the signal and then makes something of it. So how should we then frame the signal? And a lot of talk has, over the past year or so, been about sectoral approaches, that we should identify sectoral opportunities, then also sectoral barriers, obviously. But what does sectoral mean? Sectoral can mean many things, right? And the way in which I and we have suggested to think about that is to think about where are they, what we can perhaps call communities of action, that we want to reach with the signal. That is those actors, both public and private, that individually and jointly take relevant decisions for reducing emissions if we are focusing on mitigation. And I'm not sure, but perhaps the system is even transferable to other areas like adaptation and support. So if we look at sectors, as I said, if we look at the IPCC, we see certain sectors, and one can then sometimes ask and question whether these are really then communities of action. We have methane. I don't know even whether that's can be called a sector, but there's been focus on methane. But where's the community of action? There are actually several of them when you look at it more closely. There's agriculture as a source, right? That has different barriers, different drivers. There's energy-related methane emissions, and there's the waste sector, etc. So perhaps when talking about methane, it might be useful to actually then focus also on these subsectors, if you want, and say, okay, this is what we suggest in the energy-related methane field, because we know that the energy industry that is causing these methane emissions, they form a community of action. It's probably the energy ministries that are in charge of that, not the agricultural ministries, etc. The same for buildings. Buildings is a big sector, but then we have heating and cooling, and we have appliances, and these are very different groups of actors that address those. So perhaps it's good to drill down a little bit and see where are the actor communities that we actually want to achieve and want to reach, and how can we frame the signal for them so that it is clear for them that they can receive us. And then we have also kind of, we're suggesting to obviously focus on the biggest, the most important opportunities. We probably cannot cover everything. Well, let's see, perhaps we can cover a lot. But what should be criteria perhaps to identify priorities? Obviously, we're in this critical decade, focused very much on the short, medium-term impact. Where can emissions really be reduced over the coming 8 to 10 years? But we also need to keep in mind the longer-term benefits that can be reaped, because we know that after this critical decade, there's more work to be done, and that needs to be prepared. So also analyze opportunities in that respect, what in the long term is necessary and possible. And also the broader side benefits, right? Like economically, socially, but also with respect to the environment, where are the co-benefits for biodiversity, etc. And obviously there you can probably cover that by thinking about the sustainable development goals. Okay, so that's the signal and the sectoral approach. Let's turn a little bit to the wider landscape. And obviously in the global stocktake, there might be a tendency naturally under the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC to focus on what's going on under the Paris Agreement, the core of it, NDCs, etc. But we have also over the past 10 years or so seen an enormous growth beyond that. Action in other international organizations, Lavanya already mentioned ICAO, IMO, other treaties like the Montreal Protocol, but also a great number of transnational initiatives and international cooperative initiatives, where sometimes it's private actors getting together, sometimes it's private actors with public actors getting together, and sometimes it's just governments mainly acting beyond and outside of the UNFCCC, like imagine the global methane pledge. So that is covered somehow in the global stocktake with this phrase of enhancing international cooperation, right? So I think there is a basis for speaking to that. And thinking about how to enhance the contribution of these other areas that we have beyond the UNFCCC, and to think about how we can connect them to the core UNFCCC regime, the Paris Agreement, and perhaps synergize. And yeah, one of the issues there is obviously to be addressed, to be thought about accountability. That has been a big issue also since the recent report that was published. But then also how to more closely align these initiatives to the Paris goals, and where perhaps there's scope to do more and fill more gaps where gaps still exist in this field. But just to look at the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and this wider landscape as something that needs to come together and needs to do the job together. So how the UNFCCC could help with that, how the Marrakesh partnership, the high-level champions, potentially could be developed further to reap more of the potential that exists. How, as I mentioned already, this wider landscape could be linked into the intergovernmental process somehow to let both areas flourish. That's something that I think that we can think about still more over the coming year, and perhaps get some signal from the GST outcome to help us advance that area as well. I think that brings me to the end, but happy to follow up in the next round. Back to you, Jennifer. Thanks.
Thanks, Sebastian. I really like that framing around communities of actors. And when you think about the messaging about, getting these communities of actors, what kind of framing signal do they need to think about what they can do, how they can implement more and support action? And then there was also mention of the GST identifying barriers. Those communities of actors might be the best place to overcome those barriers, or maybe the absence of that community is a barrier, and that's something that the GST needs to think about. And then I also think that Glasgow and Sharm here are highlighting these communities of action and transnational initiatives in a way that we haven't really been seeing before. So clearly we're in a place where there's new and innovative ways to include non-party stakeholders as key partners in climate action, which nicely leads me to introducing Casey Cronin, the Director of Global Intelligence at the ClimateWorks Foundation. And ClimateWorks has a really great expansive initiative called the IGST, which is a consortium of civil society actors working together to support the GST. Casey, I was at your panel yesterday, and I could see there's real enthusiasm from some of the panelists for really being able to engage directly and alongside parties during the technical dialogues. Would love to hear from you how civil society can really engage with and support the global stocktake in order to make it as effective and robust as it can be. Casey, I turn to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you also to the other panelists. It's great to be learning from you all. You covered a lot of ground already, but I will try not to repeat too much. The IGST, it's a consortium of about 25 civil society organizations right now. We started formally in 2019, actually at the end of the Talanoa dialogue, recognizing the global stocktake is coming, and how could we, that group of organizations, but also the broader independent community, be more coordinated to think about and prepare for and then support the global stocktake. So that's where we're at. I think I noted in the first panel, we're about halfway through this 2-year process. And actually, I mean, just to be very candid, it's been very exciting to see how the phrase learning by doing is really being applied. That the first technical dialogue in June had a structure to it. There are some things that worked well, some that didn't work as well. And then there was a lot of space for input, including from non-party stakeholders and civil society on how to expand the structure and think about it for the second technical dialogue. And I think, again, it was stated already, but it's worth, this one actually I think is maybe worth restating multiple times in many ways how successfully open and inclusive the second technical dialogue was. I don't want to say it was perfect. It obviously wasn't perfect, but in many ways it was much more open and inclusive than we could have dreamed of. And for a UN process, it actually really was quite inspiring. I think, yes, as was alluded to, there's a lot of energy now coming out of that, the second technical dialogue. I think there's going to be space to further consult and provide input on the process. I don't think there will be as much space to further open it up in the third technical dialogue. In some ways, I think there will be now a focusing that is necessary. But I think in terms of creativity around formats and fora, there's still space for non-party stakeholders and civil society to give input. I think there's also, it's really important to actually continue to, not just on this panel, to reiterate to each other, to people who are not here in Sharm at COP, but just how open and inclusive that process was, how valuable it was, and that should not be taken for granted. And in fact, I actually think next year it's going to be even more important that the technical dialogue is one thing, to have that be open and inclusive. How we see some of that openness and inclusivity continue into the consideration of outputs phase is very unclear, and in fact, definitely should not be taken for granted. So looking ahead more to next year, I think coming out from the second technical dialogue, just being ambassadors, really sharing about what happened, what worked, and thinking critically and constructively for the third technical dialogue. I think a lot of our focus as a community then will need to be, certainly in the first half of the year, looking to that third technical dialogue, both continuing that learning by doing approach, ensuring that it is still inclusive and open, but also there's a last round of inputs to provide to the third technical dialogue. That deadline should be, I think, the beginning of March. It might be the end of February. It's worth double checking. But that we collectively, and I think this is alluded to, civil society and non-party stakeholders, have submitted the bulk of the information that is feeding into the technical dialogue. And I think yet there's still space now to look back at that. What gaps are there? What have we not said? What is not being covered? And to do one last push to really bring information into the process. I think there's space for us as civil society to work with each other to also think about how can we help synthesize, summarize, aggregate some of the themes and calls we want to see, so that going from that breadth, there's also starting to be more focus. I think that's from the co-facilitators where they're going to be looking to take it, and that really that focus on forward-looking, on solutions, on good practices is going to be really helpful. So alongside the process of preparing for the third technical dialogue, there's now this new process that has been laid out to really think about that handoff from the technical dialogue to the consideration outputs phase. So there's several points in the first half of the year, I think, to help bring in thinking from civil society and non-party stakeholders. It's not clear how much they will be invited formally, both into the design and thinking around that process, as well as on the process itself, but they haven't been excluded from it either. And mid-February, there is a call for inputs into thinking about that process, and there will be a consultation workshop, I believe, in April, an update in June around the technical dialogues, and then the process will formally kick off after that, running through COP28 with another in-person workshop in October. So I think there's two areas and tracks really for non-party stakeholders and civil society to be thinking about engaging, helping to complement what is feeding into the third technical dialogue to make sure it's both comprehensive, but then also thinking towards a more focused outcome, and then thinking about the ways that is handed off into the consideration of outcomes and handed off in a way that the voices from civil society still are there at the table, are able to complement and round out and ensure that openness and inclusion is met. I think I don't have a lot more to add other than what the other panelists said at this point. So turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much. And that's a good lead into sort of thinking about 2023. I mean, we have this process to start consideration of outputs and the final outcome of the global Stocktake. But unfortunately, our fifth speaker couldn't join us, but that gives us a little bit more time. So I wanted to invite any of the panelists to react to each other's statement. We have some minutes. I'll open the floor if anybody wants to sort of provide some early reactions. Anyone? Sebastian?
Well, I'm sure others also have something to say. I mean, I think some of the speakers have already talked about that. The crucial thing now is perhaps how we move and how we link the technical dialogue with the consideration of outputs. And obviously they will start discussions, as was just said, like with inputs already while the technical dialogue is still going on. And then there will be these convenings in between, again, while the technical dialogue is still going on. And one may then wonder what the rules should be for what comes into the consideration of outputs and how it links with the technical dialogue, right? Whether there should be a rule of something that whatever enters the outcome or outcomes should have some kind of grounding in the technical dialogue, or whether there will be completely new ideas that will suddenly enter politically for the consideration of outcomes. And perhaps also the other way around, where major ideas have, been raised and have received a lot of support in the technical dialogues, whether they can simply be kicked out, as sometimes happens in political processes. So I think some of the early discussions may actually have to focus on these kind of more questions of how does one approach the consideration of outputs, rather than raising them immediately what the outputs would be, also because the outputs are still being generated, right, of the technical dialogue. Just some random thoughts. Thanks.
Lavanya, did you want to respond?
I wanted to pick up on a couple of things, Jen. Thanks. In reaction initially to Sebastian's comments, which I thought were sort of very thoughtful as always, and this notion of communities of action that you also picked up on, Jen. I mean, my question to Sebastian is, how do we actually translate signals from these sort of, pretty formulaic sort of UN processes into signals that go that deep and that specific to particular communities of action? I was wondering if he had some insights on how that translation can happen, because the kind of political signals that usually emerge from these processes are fairly high level. So if you're actually trying to target particular communities of action, what form should these signals take? We know the general substance of these signals, but what form should they take to be able to sort of reach these communities of action? So I guess that's one question that I had for Sebastian. I was, wondering if you could have a conversation on that. And I think the second point I wanted to pick up on, which Sebastian also picked up on, and Casey did as well, is the transition from the technical to the political phase. There is always a risk that some parties will see the political phase as independent of the technical, and that it will have its own momentum and own dynamic. But there needs to be, if this has to be an effective sort of global stocktake, there needs to be a very clear and organic and seamless sort of transition from the technical to the political. And since we're still in the middle of the technical dialogue process, it's, I think, useful to feed back into that process, whether it's from the wider landscape of actors or from parties, how the technical dialogue's output, which is a synthesis report, the key findings, can actually lend itself to political signals of a certain sort that we need to reach communities of action and to reach the wider international community as well. So just to sort of start some sort of initial thinking around what kind of signals and how we translate the outputs from the technical dialogue into that. And one suggestion that we've made in the past as well is to actually not just have key findings emerge from the technical dialogue, but also key gaps, which can then lead to more sort of information generation. But in addition, some very specific implementable sort of operationalizable menu of options across sectors and communities, and directed at particular communities of action, to keep with what Sebastian has been saying, to take cue from him. So how do we frame those so that they can actually then be referred back to in the political process as well, so we have some actual implementation possibilities at the end? Thank you.
So I know Juliana wants to jump in, and then I can turn the floor back to Sebastian if you want to try to answer that. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I fully align myself with the previous comments. I just wanted to add that I feel that in the way forward, we still need to have some more clarity on how the GST as a whole will articulate with other ongoing processes. We have mentioned here these work programs on mitigation that we still don't know the form it will take in this COP, but we also have the work on the global goal adaptation and on the new qualitative collective column finance to be finalized in 2024. And of course, there will be inputs on these processes that will fit into the GST, but also perhaps the GST can have also a role in sort of supporting the results of those processes that will end the next year. So it was my impression during this session that we're still working in silos, each work program, each technical discussion within its mandate, and we're not seeing the whole picture and how everything will have to fit in the end, since we're basically trying to do the same, trying to solve the same issues. So I fully agree that there needs to be a good momentum around this process, and that the political engagement, of course, of the current and also the incoming presidents will be crucial. Yesterday, there was this high-level event from the Egyptian presidency, also highlighting the importance of the GST as a place that will articulate many of the things that and many of the work that has been going on under the Paris Agreement and the Convention today. And perhaps if we have time, I would like to ask Casey if there is any lesson learned from the Talanoa process that you think will be useful for the upcoming phase of the GST, especially in the challenge that we have of translating technical inputs and all of these dialogues into political decisions. Thank you.
Casey, did you want to have a minute or did you want to address that? No.
Sure. Yeah, sorry about disconnecting there. I would say, so yeah, early on we did have some work, actually, 3 different small research projects that were looking both at the Talanoa dialogue, but other review processes like periodic review, working the SDGs review process, but just thinking about how does this actually translate to an increase in future ambition, or how does the process play out? And it does come back to how does it get from the global into the regional and then really the national, sometimes even into the subnational all the way down to the local. So that starts to get conceptually and practically quite challenging. And I think that's also where we're at right now with the global stocktake is this question. Both next year, I think it will be important. How does this start to go back to the national level, and is there pressure coming up within from civil society, for instance, onto their national governments? And is it from different ministries within the same government talking to each other? But how is that starting to ripple out? And then in 2024, after the conclusion of the global stocktake, that's actually where the rubber will hit the road, so to speak. I don't know if that's the right expression here, but how do you get, at the end of the day, action at the national level? And action at the national level is often building up from action at the subnational level. There's pressure from regional counterparts, and that really how we're thinking about that as civil society groups and how we can engage next year, and then really in 2024 and 2025. Apologies if I missed something in the earlier questions when I disconnected.
That was great. And then Sebastian, I wanted to turn it back to you because you had some tough questions about translating the political signals into more granular signals that non-party stakeholders and others can take forward.
Yes, thanks. And indeed, these are obviously no easy questions, and I don't necessarily have all the answers quite yet, but we still have a year to go to find it. Just a few thoughts. I think it's right that usually kind of we think of these declarations or COP decisions, they're pretty high level, right? So then to speak to very specific subsectors where there are communities of action may be challenging. That may speak on the one hand on focusing for that level of messaging on those that are particularly big and should be priorities. Where the potential is high, as I said, where the longer term benefits are high, etc. So the bigger of those. Apart from that, I think Lavanya was also talking about the possibility of annexes, etc. There one can perhaps be a little bit more granular, and also when structuring them, think about whether this speaks sufficiently to communities that can pick it up. And yeah, as I said, that's then a question, how does one frame this perhaps? What is sectoral? What should we talk to just the building sector, or say, well, here in this heating and cooling, you have a particular opportunity, etc. And this is not mutually exclusive, right? You can have both the bigger sector, but then also point out where the real action needs to happen. And apart from that, it makes me think that perhaps in addition to just these formal outcomes, we need to think about this also longer term, and how these messages will actually be taken forward and then be translated and be brought to these communities that may not necessarily read all the annexes of, be it as a decision or be it some other document, but then perhaps needs to be a mechanism and people who help with the translation and say, listen, here, that's what the international level said. And some role in this may also play that we do have in some of these sectors and sub-sectors actually good framings already, the global climate pathways, etc., that are not necessarily known all over the place. So it's also a matter of not only the outcome itself translating, but the outcome or outcomes being taken afterwards and being translated by real people with resources, etc., so that it can work at the regional, at the national level, but also with the wide variety of non-party stakeholders that need to be involved. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. So between your points and Casey's points, I mean, we're looking, I mean, thinking beyond, I mean, we're all focused on how the global stocktake will conclude next year, but it's clear we should also be thinking about the process beyond that, right? Casey was talking about rubber hitting the road, right? How do we implement what comes out of the global stocktake? How do we translate these messages for like longer term action? How do we speak to the actors on the ground and translate these signals into real action? And how does that ripple ahead into the process and the evolution of the Paris regime? So Lavanya, I'd like to turn back to you because you've been thinking about this. So I invite you to share a few of your thoughts as we sort of think ahead beyond the global stocktake's conclusion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. I have been thinking about this, but these are very initial thoughts and subject to change, so I'm not going to be held accountable for them. I should sort of caveat my remarks. But I guess the thinking really is that we are seeing events overtake. Over events, science, geopolitical shifts, the poly crisis that we're part of, actually overtake many of the agreements in some senses that were reached in 2015 or 2018. We're seeing sort of rapid change on many fronts. For instance, the GST itself is designed as a 5-year process that's going to lead to, it's going to inform new NDCs. But what we're actually seeing is that, with new processes being set up, in response to the science, in response to the 1.5-degree report, in response to sort of the huge impetus and momentum towards net zero by mid-century, what we're seeing is that actually the ambition cycle is getting compressed. So I guess the kind of questions I have for the future of the regime is, how does it continue to evolve, whether it's the global stocktake, which continues to evolve, and the UN climate regime more generally in the Paris Agreement, how does it continue to evolve and be responsive to all these shifts that we are seeing, shifts, like I said, in scientific knowledge. So we should actually be shifting in some senses in response to that. Shifts to the political consensus that's evolving, the different sort of geopolitical sort of changes that are occurring. How does it evolve and respond to these shifts? And how does it therefore become and continue to be fit for purpose in terms of environmental effectiveness? So for instance, more specifically, how can the regime balance the demands of these NDC cycles, including the global stocktake, with long-term net zero trajectories, right? So it is something that was envisaged in Article 4.1, but the momentum that has sort of emerged since the 1.5-degree IPCC report has taken us in a sort of far more sort of concrete net zero direction than we imagined in 2015. So how does the sort of NDC cycles and the global stocktake, which is more sort of focused on the here and now and the next 5 years, how does it relate to the next 20, 30 years, right? So that's something we need to think about as the regime is evolving. How do we move to an all-of-society approach? We've all been talking about the wider landscape of actors, Sebastian and Casey in particular, and communities of action even. How can the regime further locate itself at the center or as an anchor in this wider landscape of actors? And I think we probably also have to deal with the fact that at some point we are currently on an overshoot pathway. And while this is a critical decade, as others have also said, we still do need to take action after 2030. So this doesn't end at 2030. And at that point, we're going to have, if we're on an overshoot pathway, enhanced demands for adaptation and loss and damage. We're already beginning to see that. So how does the regime shift focus to those sorts of demands? How does it evolve? In a word, how can we actually future-proof this regime? So I think those are the kinds of questions that we've begun to think about collectively in the context of how we sort of keep the momentum going on this regime, which there is a lot of investment in, and there's a lot of participation in and ownership of across 197 states and many non-state actors. So I think these are just initial questions, and so questions and perhaps provocative questions about how the regime itself evolves. But it's important to perhaps start thinking along those lines, given the trajectories that we're on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have a few minutes left, and I will very quickly answer a question that's come in from the audience before wrapping up. And it's a question about whether we've solicited feedback from any of these communities of action. Do they feel included? And maybe the media needs to be engaged more to translate some of these messages. We did have a workshop on the sidelines of Climate Week, where we did speak to some of these stakeholders. And some of what we found out is that they're just, like as Sebastian said, they're just not aware of some of these initiatives. They weren't aware of some of the trajectories or the pathways or the high-level champions approach. So there's really a lot more work that needs to be done there. And that's part of what we'll be doing. We'll be thinking about this. So I will wrap up here. I really hope the audience enjoyed these initial reflections, and we'll have to ourselves reflect further on these points in the coming weeks and months. Please look up our project online. You can Google C2ES and Opportunity for Ambition, and that will bring you to our landing page. And we've made several submissions to the GST and hope to have a new publication early next year. So I'd like to thank the panelists so much for your time. Thank you to the audience for joining us and taking the time out of your day and out of the COP. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.